Thank you for this opportunity to tell you my family's story. My name is Su Yin Ju, and I'm a second generation Chinese American. This is the story of Ju Zhou and his family on an asparagus ranch in Van Nuys in the San Fernando Valley, which is now called Lake Balboa. In the front row are his two American-born daughters. From left to right, Dorothy, who was born in 1921, and her older sister Corinne, who was born in 1919. In the second row is Zhuzhou the patriarch, who immigrated to America in 1874, and his wife Liang Shi, who immigrated to Los Angeles in 1918 with their two sons in the back row. San Yu, the oldest, was 15 years old at the time of immigration, and his youngest brother, San Tong, was 13 years old in 1918, and San Tong is my father. In 1856, Zhuzhou was born in Samgong Village in the Pearl River Delta of Guangdong Province, very near Macau and Hong Kong. The village is also called Sanjiang in Mandarin, but I use Cantonese because that's the dialect that I grew up in. Well, this was the last stand for the Song dynasty against Kublai Khan's Mongolian forces conquering China. So the Song dynasty established the well-field system in the village, in which 8 families, for example, could farm private plots of land, but the central 9th plot was public domain. No family could own it, but it was farmed by everyone in the village, all the families, for the benefit of the whole. At the same token, the clan ownership of property followed the same principle, and this established a collective consciousness for the villagers in Samgong. By the time Zhuzhou was in his teenage years, the Qing dynasty was in its decline, and uprose a lot of rebellions and wars and fighting in the area. Families lost their crops and even their property. And for Zhuzhou's family, so poor they lived in a chicken coop, they lost their crop. So in order to survive, Zhuzhou sailed to America to grow his dream in America in order to support his family in China. In 1874, at the age of 17, Zhuzhou sailed on the SS Japan, on which he worked as a cabin boy for first-class passengers, and this was his introduction to Western culture for the first time. The SS Japan was a large wooden sidewheel steamer commissioned by President Abraham Lincoln 6 weeks before his assassination. The ship was now owned by the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and it docked Zhuzhou at China Basin, which is right next to today's Oracle Ball Park. In those days, there was very simple customs and immigration processing, and so Zhuzhou found himself easily standing in front of Market Street, amazed at what he saw because life was so different from a Chinese village, and he made his way up DuPont Street, which is today's Grand Avenue, to register with the Chinese Six Companies. Now, the Chinese Six Companies is a consolidated benevolent association made up of merchants in Chinatown who came from specific districts in the Pearl River Delta, and they helped newcomers who arrived from their specific districts. They helped them to settle and find housing, jobs, helped them with legal issues, and if a person died in America, the Six Companies was very instrumental in transporting the deceased back to their respective villages for proper burial. So the Guangzhou Sunhui district helped Zhuzhou find a job in Napa Valley. And he worked in the vineyards of Marysville and St. Helena. And in those days, it was backbreaking work because the vines grew on the ground. They didn't yet have sticks where it made harvesting so much easier. However, anti-Asian sentiment grew very physical and very vitriol against the Chinese, and they were chased out of Napa Valley. So Zhuzhou went to Oakland's railroad yards to look for work, and he found a job with the Southern Pacific Railroad working on the San Luis Obispo line that connected Northern California to Los Angeles. Now the line was very much needed because the Butterfield stagecoach could not handle the steep cliffs of Ventura, and when the stagecoach reached that point, it had to drive its team down into the surf along the beach to make it down to LA. So the line was very much needed. But Zhuzhou found out that he had to register with the Hall of Records in San Francisco as an alien for the first time. 4 months prior to the passing of the first Chinese exclusion laws, Zhuzhou wanted to become an American citizen. So he returned to the six counties and asked the elders for advice on how to become an American citizen. But at the time, the anti-Chinese sentiment grew even stronger, and there were daily lynchings of Chinese and burning of Chinese camps and beatings of Chinese on the sidewalks. And the elders told Zhuzhou that perhaps at this time it was too risky because they didn't even know what was going to happen to the Chinese already living and working in America. As fate would have it, 4 months later, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 passed as federal law, and this prevented Zhuzhou and other Chinese immigrants like him from ever becoming a U.S. citizen. Likewise, down the line, the Alien Land Law of 1913 prevented Chinese from owning land. If you were not a U.S. citizen, it said, then you could not own land, nor could you lease land for more than 3 years. And this was intended to prevent Chinese and Japanese from participating in the agricultural industry that was mainly dominated by the white community. Although Zhuzhou was prevented from participating in mainstream American society, he was so determined to grow a dream in America and support his family back in China at the same time. So he heard about farming opportunities opening in the San Fernando Valley, and he moved himself out of Los Angeles' Chinatown and became the first Asian to settle and farm in the San Fernando Valley. However, he realized that you could not make it all by yourself on your own. You needed the help of good white friends in the dominant society to help you and who knew about American business. Otto F. Brandt owned a huge ranch in Woodland Hills, which today is called Warner Ranch. His friend, General Harrison Gray Otis, founded the Los Angeles Times newspaper, and he owned a large ranch in Encino area now called Tarzana, and his son-in-law, Harry Chandler, owned a transport business in the valley. Well, the four of them became very good friends, and the Chandler family and the Brandt family, together with William Mulholland of the LA Water Commission and Moses Sherman of the Pacific Electric Railway and other prominent Los Angeles leaders, formed the Los Angeles Suburban Homes Land Syndicate, and together they bought over 47,000 acres of land in the valley and subdivided it into Van Nuys, Reseda, and Canoga Park. With the help of William Mulholland, who diverted the Owens Valley water through the valley before it reached Los Angeles. This created an agricultural boom for the San Fernando Valley. Through Otto Brandt's land title, insurance, and trust company, Jujo bought 700 acres of prime agricultural land in Van Nuys in the San Fernando Valley, now called Lake Balboa, as I said earlier. This was the year 1919. And notice that the northern boundary of the property was Sherman Way, running south to Leesdale Road. Leesdale Road was an irrigation pipeline roadway that ran from the Pettit Ranch eastward, and it was located just above today's Victory Boulevard. The property also ran east-west from Havenhurst to Balboa, but look where Jujo built his original barns and living quarters. It coincided exactly with the well field system, so he in effect transported this collective consciousness from Samgong Village to his new good earth in the San Fernando Valley. Because Jujo could not own land in his own name, he put the property in his first U.S.-born daughter, Corinne's name, and he built two structures, the horse barn that faces Van Owen Street and a packing house right next to it. And he lived in his big horse barn because old-timers like him never thought of setting down permanent roots in this country because of the exclusion laws. So they worked to earn money to send back to China to support their families. Inside the horse barn, there were 3 little rooms that were walled off from the horses. One room had a bed and a bathtub in it, and I remember once seeing this beautiful Victorian bathtub with 4 claw legs set against the wall, and Jujo's bed was right next to it. Then there was a little storage area where he kept his rice, sacks of rice, and produce for cooking. And in a little kitchenette, he had a potbelly stove to cook. There was a door where he could walk across to his packing house. There was also a door in his room with the bed and bathtub that opened into where the horses were. To the far left of the diagram, you see Jujo's 4x10 buck wagon. This buck wagon's flatbed was reinforced 8 inches thick like a Conestoga wagon in order to support a payload of 12,000 pounds of asparagus crates. And the iron wheels were 3 to 4 inches wide in order to be able to carry that load. Jujo would hitch 4 horses to that buck wagon and drive it 3 hours each way over the Cahuenga Pass, which was a dirt wagon trail that led into the Los Angeles Plaza. This is where truck farmers parked their wagons and sold their produce off the trucks. So Jujo's became a truck farmer in the San Fernando Valley. In 1903, Jujo returned to Samgong Village to marry and raise a family. Here he built a more permanent home. It was a compound in which he built houses for his 3 other brothers and their families, and he built a 2-story home for himself. And all the brothers and their families would come over to Jujo's main house for all their communal activities. And that was the Chinese custom. It was all for one and one for all. All of a sudden, though, the remittances from Jujo's brother back in Los Angeles stopped. He had brought his younger brother Jushi to Los Angeles to teach him the business of asparagus farming and wholesaling, and he was to send money back to Jujo in the village. But all of a sudden it stopped, and so Jujo left his family and returned to Los Angeles to find out what happened. Jujo discovered that his brother Jushi had sold the whole business because he thought that Jujo would never return to America, and he wanted to be a mining engineer, not a farmer. And so he took off for Paris and made his way to Manchuria. Meanwhile, Jujo took him 9 years to rebuild his fortune, and when he did, he sent for his wife and 2 sons to join him in Los Angeles. The year was 1918, and this was a very arduous trip just to get to Hong Kong, because you had to camp out on a river and wait for a small boat, a little dinghy, to come by, and then you would bargain with the boatman to take you to the middle of the river and wait for a large rice barge. Once the rice barge came by, then you hooked up with the barge, and it dragged you and other families in boats behind you like a choo-choo train up the river all the way to Gongmun Harbor, where it was the only exit and entry into the Pearl River Delta. There you caught a ferry, and then you had to navigate the Little West River all the way down around Macau and over to Hong Kong. This was very arduous. By then, San Yu was 15 years old, as I said earlier, and San Tong was already 13 years old, and Liang Shi was 34 years old. By 1920, Jujo built a cottage for his wife and children to move them from Los Angeles' Chinatown to join him on the ranch. And he built a cottage for himself that was located around the work area, because he spent most of his time in the asparagus operations. Dr. Hun Yang did an excellent job defining the 2 historical periods on the Jujo Ranch. The gray area was in Jujo's time from 1919 to 1944, although he did die in 1941. The brown area is the area from 1945 to 1955, in which his sole surviving son, San Tong, built a more permanent home and establishment for the multi-generational family. Jujo's new cabin reflected his taste for the simple life. It was an all-dirt floor, but he did have a raised wooden floor for his bedrooms, about 3 inches raised off the ground. However, because it's a dirt floor, when the rainy seasons came, it got kind of muddy and wet, and Liang Shi and the children would have to put on the rain boots and march over with the food to have dinner with Jujo, the patriarch, in his alt-dirt floor dining area. In contrast, Liang Shi's 20 by 40 foot redwood cottage had a lot more modern conveniences. It was an all wooden floor, and I remember spending my first 2 years of life in this little cottage, all 8 of us in a 20 by 40 foot house. There was a backyard wash tub in which my mother and grandmother did laundry out in the backyard. Next to it was an ice box, and I remember my grandmother's black iron stove that used to sit in the kitchen area, but when my father moved the family here to run the asparagus operations, he bought a modern 4-burner gas stove. However, in cooking, we could never open the kitchen window because there was a big hornet's nest there. And you couldn't open the window to let the cooking smoke out. And I remember crawling around and hearing the hornets slam against the glass window pane. Also, asparagus shoots would pop up in between the wooden floorboards. And it was like little trees growing here and there as I was crawling around. So it was a very interesting little house filled with wonderful memories. In time, the family's asparagus operations grew nationwide. So it started at the Los Angeles Plaza as a truck farming business, and it grew, as you can see, at the LA Wholesale Mart on San Pedro Street in 1930. Joe and his sons had a warehouse there. The upper floor was their office, and down below was the loading dock in which freight cars came by and you loaded up the asparagus crates in these cars, these refrigerated cars, and they would travel to different destinations, making stops all across the country to New York City. Our longtime clients were Safeways and Ralph's grocery store chains and others, too, that did business with the Joe Company for over 30 years. World War II brought prosperity to all the farmers in the San Fernando Valley. All the white farmers elected Santong Ju to be their first Chinese chairperson of the valley's Fresh Produce Growers Association. So it was Santong's job to coordinate all the produce in the San Fernando Valley for the U.S. Farm Bureau, for the soldiers fighting in Europe and in the Pacific Rim. Normally, we operated 3 ranches, the Jujo Ranch here, the Saugus Newhall Ranch, and Santong Ju's own Porterville Ranch. We operated 3 ranches simultaneously, but in high season, we operated 5 ranches simultaneously. Santong staggered each ranch's harvest season so that we could produce asparagus nearly year-round. We farmed 3,000 acres every year, and when the war came, the young men went off to war, and the U.S. government introduced the Bracero program. The Bracero program brought Mexican workers to work temporarily on the farms, the factories, and railroads. And they also lived on the ranches that they worked on. Also, Santong would send a truck out to various points in Van Nuys early in the morning to pick up other workers that included women and men from all different ethnic backgrounds. And among the women, one was the mother of singer Richie Valens. Her name was Connie Valenzuela, and she worked on the Jujo Ranch for many years. The women only worked in the packing house, sorting and grading asparagus that were moving on a conveyor belt. The men did all the other heavy work in the warehouse and in the fields. Notice in the upper part of this photograph tall fruit and nut trees around the work areas. It not only provided shade for the workers, but it provided a source of food and snacks for the workers, because in those days the farms in the valley were very large and you didn't see grocery stores and cafes in a whole lot of places. So this provided extra food for the workers to add to their lunches. In the foreground, in 1945, Santong built a multi-generational homestead, and this became the headquarters for the Jew family on 2 continents. In the left foreground, you'll see little vegetable gardens in which my mother and grandmother grew vegetables and herbs to sustain the large extended family in the big homestead. Although the exterior of the big homestead was Western looking, Santong and his architect George Chapman designed together a Chinese symbol for the front door, and the word is Fuk, which means good fortune in Chinese, and in Mandarin it is pronounced Fu. The blessing on the front door symbolized a lifestyle inside the family's home. It was half Western and half Chinese, and the Chinese influence was most felt at the dinner table because traditional Chinese etiquette in dining observes respect for elders and for each person's rank within the family. For example, the head of the family, in this case Santong, always sat the person with the highest honor to his left, which was my grandmother Liang Shi, and then to his right, the next highest person of honor to his right. So then it worked left, right, all the way down the rank to the mother who sits closest to the kitchen. And if we had an honored guest for dinner to join us, that guest was always flanked by the men in the family to show the person highest respect. Also, the grandmother, the highest honor person, was always served first, and she never served herself. He or she, holding the highest honor, is always served and cared for by family members. Then it is followed by the men who serve themselves on the dishes, from the dishes on the table, followed by the women, and it all goes by rank. In time, there emerged internal struggles about each person's Chinese American identity that involved how you perceive the other person and how you perceived yourself. The Chinese exclusion laws put pressure on the family, but pressure also came from the intergenerational conflicts of value between two different generations. Add to that intra-generational conflicts in which there were changing dynamics of power that affected relationships in the family. In the Chinese view, relationships are key to maintaining a balance between the individual, the family, and the wider community. And the family, jia in Chinese, forms the smallest unit in Chinese society. It is not the individual. So each unit is viewed as a fraction of the whole, like little pieces of puzzle that must fit in to the whole. So the objective in Chinese society is to strive for unity. In contrast, the Western view is that all things can be measured, can be separated, and classified. And history is seen as a progression in a linear trajectory from a lower point to a higher point. The individual is viewed as the smallest unit in society, and it is not the family. But there are two ethics of social behavior that are very important in a Chinese family. One of them is Li, which means acting with honor and placing others first before yourself. The focus is on personal character and development of self-discipline, meaning that your journey on earth is bigger than yourself because you have a fealty to the greater community around you. The other ethic is Ren or Zhen in Cantonese, in which a family is based on a deep-rooted idea of fair play, respect, loyalty, and affection among all members. But look what happens when these values are transferred to a new culture in transnational migration and assimilation. The older generation bring values from the old country with them, and they are content to live within those values. Those values and beliefs do not change, and this was true for Zhuzhou and his wife Liang Shi. The youngest generation assimilate very easily into their host country's culture, values, and language. And this was Corinne and Dorothy. But even among this generation, the speed of assimilation was very different. The middle generation, of which San Tong and his brother San Yu belong to, they suffer because they are the workhorse for their transnational family with its ties in two different countries. So they cannot enjoy the benefits in the new culture. They are caught between two generations with two different values, and they're called upon to mediate their family's inevitable culture clashes. This was San Tongju's fate, who was the surviving son of Zhou. Each person had different perceptions of the other person's identity. For example, the age difference between Dorothy and her father, Zhou, was 65 years apart. So she looked at him in a more of a one-dimensional way, that when he lectured to her, she could not relate to it. She felt that he didn't connect with her reality of the world around her, which was feeling the pressure of conforming to American values. Zhou, on the other hand, saw his role very multi-dimensional. He was the patriarch of all the branches of his family, so he had to look out for each of them. For example, when his older brother, Nui, passed away, then his grandnephew, Siklun, was alone in the village. So Zhou brought Siklun to join him on the Zhuzhou ranch, but there was a lot of animosity towards Chinese at the time and a lot of problems with the paperwork to land him. And so Zhuzhou went to Chinatown and hired Y.C. Hong, a very prominent immigration attorney who founded New Chinatown and also worked with the Chandler family in developing the Port of Los Angeles. So Y.C. Hong was the first Chinese American to pass the California bar. Also, at the same time that he was representing my cousin Loon, he was invited by the U.S. Supreme Court to be able to argue cases before its tribunal. He was the first Chinese American invited to do so. And you can see then in Chinatown, a network was developing among Chinese Americans to help each other. And it radiated outwards to the other suburban areas where the Chinese communities were. And this relationship building developed to form networks that tied the community together. The Chinese Americans helped each other. The age difference between Santong and his youngest sister, Dorothy, was 16 years apart, so he looked at the relationship with her as a father and daughter would. But in contrast, Dorothy saw herself as an equal to her brother. They were in the same generation, so she felt she was doing him a favor in holding the family lands in her name, and it was not an obligation or duty. She was doing him a favor in that he owed her something. At the same time, each member had different views about their own Chinese American identity. Santong saw his identity as half American and half Chinese. He embraced the American culture, its tastes and values, but when it came to family, he embraced the traditional Chinese family values because he was the patriarch of the family now, and it was his duty, he felt, to preserve and to pass along the traditional Chinese family values to the next generation. Dorothy, on the other hand, saw herself completely immersed in the American culture. She amputated her Chinese heritage and really felt very strongly about being pulled back into her Chinese heritage. On the other hand, Corinne was kind of caught in the middle. she was a little confused because she was born in America and felt very Americanized. But what is it that you select from your Chinese heritage to keep? And excuse me, which ones do you discard? And as I said before, each person was assimilating at different speeds within the same generation. There was also the conflict between a group orientation in thought and individualism, in which each person should make their own choices. So it became very positional, and Dorothy sued her brother Santong to clear title to all the Jew properties in her name. She left him with nothing. At the same time, the family farms in the San Fernando Valley were vanishing. A lot of farms were being sold for residential subdivision after World War II, and also aerospace industries were moving into the valley. For example, Rocketdyne had a huge missile testing site in the Santa Susana Pass, and you'd hear those giant jet engines being tested, and the sound and the ground shaking were felt all through the valley. So there was no way for Santong to restart his life in Southern California because the farms were gone. Santong went to Mexico to restart his life and start from scratch, but he maintained transnational ties with Los Angeles. He noticed one day around him a lot of herbal Damiana plants growing wild in La Paz, so he imported a tea machine from Los Angeles that could produce 1,200 tea bags a day, and he re-exported the tea bags to Los Angeles. He also started making soy sauce in a small factory, and one day he found a 12-year-old boy, Manuelito, living homeless on a hillside, and he brought Manuelito back to the factory to live and work for him. And he mentored Manuelito and told him that when he grew up, he could be anything he wanted in life, but just be the best that you can in it. And Manuelito, bless his heart, he loved athletics, and so he became a very good high school coach, married, and raised a family of his own. And one day he told me how grateful he was and how much he loved Santong for changing his life. It made a big difference in him, and that made me feel good hearing that. Also, Santong found a niche in sporting events, so he imported pounds and pounds of peanuts from the Los Angeles nut house and processed the peanuts into Chinese five-spice peanuts, and he sold them at movie theaters and sporting events. But time did catch up with him. He realized that he could never make a comeback like he did in the San Fernando Valley, and his health deteriorated to the point where he had only months left to live. And so he turned over the business and trained the younger generation to take over. It was like the days when he taught at Pierce College in 1947. Pierce College opened a new agricultural school in the valley, and Santong loved teaching there, and he loved working with the young people. So Arturo was his young business partner in the tea making machine, and he loved teaching Arturo how to run the business, and left the business to him. Santong returned to Los Angeles to live with one of his daughters. He had a farmer's eye to notice things around his environment that could be useful. There was this victory garden nearby, and he loved working in that victory garden. He loved spending the days in the sunshine and feeling the breeze against his face and smelling the good earth and seeing the healthy stalks of corn that he grew and other vegetables that he grew in the garden. It reminded him of the San Fernando Valley days when he was farming, and that made him so happy. The Chinese have a saying, the hole in time heals its injured parts. And this Chinese proverb, Santong truly believed in, and so did Zhuzhou. In later years, I came to understand it for myself too, because I saw that Corinne reconciled with her brother Santong many years later. She had lived in Hong Kong for a while and came to understand where brother and father were coming from, so she stayed reconnected with her brother until the day he died. Santong's older brother San Yu's descendants also connected with the family, and Zhuzhou's older sister's descendants in Cuilapa, Guatemala, also reconnected with the family. So did Zhuzhou's two younger brothers, Zhu Shi and Zhu Yao. They reconnected with the family. The hole in time heals its injured parts. But Dorothy and her descendants, we've never had face-to-face contact and connection with them, but we leave the door open and we pray and hope that there is healing on their side too, because we are all one family, and no matter what ups and downs a family goes through, the Chinese American experience in our family and in any immigrant family around the world builds a kind of resilience that develops this kind of strength and character to be able to grow a dream again and again, no matter how hard the circumstances and no matter where you are in any country in the world. And that's the beauty of the Chinese American experience, I think. And I thank you for sharing your time with me. I thank you very much for listening to our story.